By the time I pulled into the parking lot of St. Augustin General that Tuesday morning, there were already 3 news vans parked out front. I sat in my truck for a moment, engine still running, watching a reporter adjust her earpiece in the side mirror of the van ahead of me. I didn't know her. Didn't matter. I knew why she was there. I turned off the ignition and sat in the silence. 26 years. That's how long I had given that hospital. 26 years of being the person they called at 2 in the morning when the servers went down. 26 years of knowing which cables ran behind which walls, which backup systems had quirks, which vendor contracts had hidden clauses that would bite someone in the wrong quarter. I was the one who built the patient data infrastructure from the ground up, back when the province was still debating whether electronic health records were even worth the investment. I was the one who made them worth it. And 11 days before my 62nd birthday, 11 days before I was set to collect the pension I had been paying into since before half the current executive team was out of university, they walked me into a boardroom on the 4th floor and told me my position had been eliminated. My director wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the table the whole time while the HR woman talked. She had a folder. She slid it across to me like we were closing a real estate deal. Severance terms, she said. Standard package. I had 2 weeks to return my badge and transition anything outstanding. I looked at my director. I said, out loud, directly to him, "You're doing this 11 days before my pension vests." He didn't answer, just cleared his throat and looked at the window. I took the folder, I thanked nobody, and I walked out. That was a Thursday in late October. The following Monday, St. Augustin General could not access a single patient file. I want to tell you who I was before I tell you what happened, because I think that matters. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, the kind of place where you learned early that nothing gets handed to you and nobody is coming to save you. My father worked the nickel mines for 30 years, not because he loved it, because it was steady, and steady meant we ate and the heat stayed on through February. He used to say that the only thing worth building was something that outlasted you. He meant it literally, talking about the mines. I applied it to everything else. I moved to Ottawa in my early 30s for a contract position at a regional health authority. It was supposed to be 18 months. My wife Nadine had grown up here and her family was here, so when they offered me a permanent role at St. Augustin, I didn't think twice. We bought a house in Barrhaven. Our son was 4. Our daughter wasn't born yet. I was not a person who drew attention to himself at work. I didn't need the plaques or the appreciation dinners or my name on anything. What I needed was for the systems to run. When the systems ran, I was doing my job. And for 26 years, they ran. I built ARIA. That's what I called it internally, though it never had an official name on any company documentation. Adaptive Records Integration Architecture. It was the spine of the hospital's entire digital operation. Scheduling, patient history, lab results, medication orders, surgical notes, emergency intake, all of it flowed through ARIA. I designed it to be modular, layered, and, this is the part that matters, authenticated through a verification sequence that I had embedded in the core build back in 2009 when I was worried about a security vulnerability that nobody else on the team had even flagged yet. I flagged it in writing. Sent it to my director at the time, a man named Aldous who retired in 2018. He forwarded it up. Nothing happened. I flagged it again in 2013 when we migrated to a new server environment. I sent a 12-page technical brief to the CIO's office explaining that the integration had a single-point authentication risk that needed to be addressed before we scaled further. The brief came back with a sticky note that said, "Noted, no budget cycle for this." I kept the sticky note. I flagged it a 3rd time in 2019 during a provincial audit. The auditor thanked me for my thoroughness. The hospital's response team wrote in the audit report that the concern had been reviewed and deemed low risk given existing redundancies. There were no existing redundancies. I had been the redundancy. I was the person who knew where everything was, what everything meant, and how to fix it when it broke. When they eliminated my position, they eliminated the redundancy. They just didn't know it yet. I spent the 2 weeks after my termination the way I think most people do, in a kind of suspended unreality. Nadine kept asking if I wanted to talk, and I kept saying I was fine, and neither of us believed it. I took the dog for long walks along the Rideau River in the mornings. I made coffee in the French press we only used on weekends. I sat in the garage for a few evenings doing nothing in particular, just sitting. My son called from Vancouver on the second day. He'd seen something on LinkedIn. Someone from the hospital had posted a vague comment about organizational restructuring, and he'd put two and two together. He was furious in the way that adult children get furious on your behalf, all heat and no outlet. I told him I was fine. I told him to let it go. My daughter drove over with her husband on the Saturday. She brought pierogies from the Ukrainian place on Barrhaven that I like. We ate at the kitchen table, and I watched her trying not to look worried, and I thought about how she had been 3 years old when I took that first contract in Ottawa. I thought about the morning I drove her to kindergarten in a snowstorm because the buses were canceled and Nadine had a work presentation she couldn't miss. I thought about a lot of things I hadn't let myself think about in a long time. My son-in-law, good man, quieter than my daughter by a fair margin, asked me at one point carefully if I had any concerns about the pension timeline. If I had talked to anyone. A lawyer, maybe. I told him I had made some calls. That was true. I had made some calls. I had also, before handing back my badge, done something I want to be precise about. I did not sabotage anything. I did not delete anything. I did not alter a single record or break a single function. What I did was this. I removed myself from the system. Every override credential that existed only because I had created it. Every authentication token that ran through my personal verification key. Every layer of ARIA that depended on active confirmation from my access profile to remain in its operational state. I simply stopped being in it. ARIA, without me in it, defaulted to what it had always been designed to do when its primary authentication chain was severed without a proper succession handoff. It locked. Not crashed, locked. Everything was still there. Every record, every file, every data point going back to 2001 was intact and untouched. It was simply behind a door that nobody at St. Augustin General had the key to anymore. I had documented the unlocking procedure in a binder. The binder was in a box in my garage in Barrhaven. Nobody had asked me for it. I found out what was happening from my daughter, who had a friend in the hospital's communications department. She called me on Monday morning around 10 a.m. Her voice was careful in the way it gets when she's delivering information she thinks might upset me and is watching to see how I react. She said the hospital's electronic systems had gone offline. She said there was no patient access. She said the emergency department was running on paper charts. I said, yes. She said, Dad, did you? I said, I didn't do anything, sweetheart. I just left. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said, quietly, okay. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and listened to the radio. There was a feature on about the early snowfall expected in the Gatineau Hills. Nadine came downstairs in her housecoat and looked at me looking at the radio, and she said, "It's them, isn't it?" I nodded. She sat down across from me without saying anything else. She put her hand on mine. That was all. By noon, the local news had it. By 2 in the afternoon, it was CBC. By 4, it was national. St. Augustin General experiencing critical system outage. Patients redirected to Queensway Carleton and Montfort. Hospital officials say the cause is under investigation. No timeline given for restoration of electronic health records. I watched the coverage that evening with a cup of tea. The hospital's chief operating officer gave a statement outside the main entrance. She said they were working with their technology partners to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. She said patient safety remained the top priority. She said there was no indication of a cyber attack. That last part was technically accurate. It was not a cyber attack. It was the natural consequence of removing a 26-year institutional memory without a transition plan. The call I'd been waiting for came the next morning. Not from my director. From someone above him. A woman I had met maybe 3 or 4 times in 26 years. The kind of executive who exists in the top 2 floors of a building and occasionally appears at all staff holiday events to shake hands. She introduced herself by her full name and her title, which told me immediately that this was a formal conversation and that she had a script. She said they were experiencing some significant operational challenges. I said I was aware. She said they believed the challenges might be related to the departure of certain key personnel. I said that was possible. She said they were hoping I might be available to consult on a short-term basis to assist with the transition. I let the silence sit for a few seconds. Then I said, "Under what terms?" She said she would need to loop in HR and legal before she could speak to specifics. I said, "That's fine. Have them call my lawyer." Another pause. Longer this time. Then she said, "Mister, I want to be straightforward with you. The hospital needs your help." And I said, "I know." I told her I was not going to come back into the building. I told her I was not going to be a consultant under an emergency short-term contract that would conveniently sidestep the pension liability question. I told her I had documentation, all of my documentation, every flagged memo, every ignored audit note, every written warning going back to 2009, and that my lawyer was already reviewing my options regarding the termination itself. Then I said, "But I want to be clear about something. I don't want the hospital to fail. There are patients there. I don't want anyone to be hurt." She said, "So you'll help?" I said, "I'll provide the documentation needed to restore the system. My lawyer will send over the terms." She didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, less formal. Almost, I thought, relieved. She said, "Okay." My lawyer, a woman I had been referred to by my son-in-law's colleague, sharp as anyone I have ever met, sent over terms that afternoon. Full pension reinstatement, immediate vesting of the amount that should have vested on my birthday, a formal written acknowledgement from the hospital's board that my termination had occurred in contravention of my employment agreement. An additional negotiated settlement that I am not at liberty to discuss specifically, but which Nadine cried when I told her the number. They signed within 48 hours. I couriered the binder to my lawyer's office. She delivered it to the hospital. Their IT team, a young woman named Britta who had been there maybe 3 years and apparently spent the last 48 hours without sleeping, was on the phone with me for about 90 minutes walking through the authentication restoration process. She was professional. She didn't ask me anything personal. When we were done, she said, "Thank you," and I said, "Take care of it this time." And she said, quietly, "We will." I believed her, not the hospital necessarily, her. I want to say something about what I did because I have had a lot of time to think about it, and I don't want to be dishonest with you. It was not clean. It was not without consequence for people who had nothing to do with what was done to me. The patient who had to wait longer in an emergency department because the intake system was running on paper. The nurse who had to track down a medication order through 3 phone calls instead of 1. Those are real people. Their inconvenience was real. Their worry was real. I didn't cause it on purpose, but I also knew when I walked out of that building for the last time what would happen. I had been telling them what would happen for 15 years. They had chosen, every time, not to listen. There is a version of this story where I am the villain. I know that. I have read enough of the commentary online, seen enough of the letters to the editor in the Ottawa Citizen to know that there are people who think what I did was worse than what was done to me. Maybe they're right. I'm not sure the scales of ethical behavior operate on a simple axis like that. I'm not sure I'm equipped to settle it. What I know is this. I gave that hospital the best 26 years of my professional life. I raised concerns, repeatedly, formally, in writing, and they were dismissed. I was removed from my position in a manner that was specifically timed to deny me a pension I had earned. And when I left exactly as I had always said I would have to leave. As the only person who understood how everything worked, because they had never invested in making sure anyone else did. I didn't build a trap. I built a system. They chose not to learn it. My birthday was on a Friday that year. Nadine made her mother's butter tart recipe, the one with the flaky crust that takes all afternoon. My daughter came with the kids. My son flew in from Vancouver. Surprised me. Didn't tell me until he was already at the airport. We sat in the backyard under the gas heater with a bottle of Scotch whiskey and a plate of butter tarts. And I looked around at all of them and I thought, this is what 26 years was actually for. Not the pension, though the pension mattered. Not the settlement. Not the thing I had built, though I was proud of what I had built. It was this. Getting here. Getting to sit in my own backyard on a cold November evening in Ottawa with the people I love, with time ahead of me, having not been quietly pushed out of something I gave everything to. My son-in-law, who tends to express sentiment in the form of well-timed practical observation, raised his glass at some point and said, "To the guy who built the thing nobody thought to learn." I laughed. It surprised me how much I meant the laugh. Nadine leaned over and put her head on my shoulder. She said very quietly, just to me, "Your dad would have liked this." She meant the toast. She meant the whole evening. She was right. He would have. My father spent 30 years underground in Sudbury because steady meant we ate and the heat stayed on. He never once complained about it in front of us, though I learned after he died that it had cost him more than he ever let on. He believed in building things that outlasted you. He believed in doing the work and not expecting anything for it that you hadn't already negotiated clearly and put in writing. He retired at 65 and was gone at 68. 3 years. 3 winters. I think about that a lot. I think about it when I go for my morning walks now, longer ones than I used to take, along the Rado past Dow's Lake when the ice hasn't come in yet. I think about all the mornings I could have done this and didn't, because I was the person on call, because the system needed me, because nobody else knew where the cables ran behind the walls. The system is running again. Britton and her team have it. I am told they've brought in 2 additional senior architects to document the full infrastructure. I am told they have begun a formal succession protocol for all critical system components. I will never go back there. I don't need to. The binder is gone. The system remembers everything I put into it, and I am finally, for the first time in 26 years, entirely my own. I still think about Aldous sometimes, not with anger. That surprised me. He was the director who first received my 2009 memo, the one who forwarded it upward and let it disappear into the quiet indifference of a budget cycle. He wasn't a bad man. He was just a man who had learned over the years that flagging uncomfortable things cost more than ignoring them, and so he ignored them. And then he retired. And then someone else inherited the silence he left behind. That's how these things work, I think. Not through malice usually, through accumulated small decisions to look the other way. Each one seems harmless enough on its own. Together, over 16 years, they built the exact conditions for everything that happened. I don't say that to excuse what the hospital did to me. What they did was wrong. Legally, I know that now in writing. But I also think there's something worth sitting with in how it unraveled. The choices they made didn't just affect me. They affected the nurses scrambling for paper charts at 2 in the morning. They affected the patient waiting in emergency intake while someone tracked down a medication order by phone. The consequences of ignoring a problem don't stay contained. They spread. They always spread. I spent 26 years trying to understand systems well enough to protect them. What I didn't fully appreciate until I was sitting at my kitchen table that Tuesday morning, listening to CBC report on the outage, was that integrity works the same way a well-built system does. It either holds under pressure or it doesn't. And you can usually tell years before the crisis which way it's going to go if you're paying attention. I was paying attention. They weren't. That's the part I keep coming back to. There's something my father modeled without ever naming it that I've only recently found words for. He went underground every day for 30 years in Sudbury. Not because he was fearless, but because he understood that the work mattered, and that doing it right mattered more than doing it easily. He documented things. He showed up. He didn't cut corners even when nobody was watching. I used to think that was stubbornness. Now I think it was the clearest form of intelligence he had, the kind that doesn't come from a credential or a title, but from caring deeply enough about something to stay honest with it even when honesty costs you. That's what I try to do with Aria. That's what the memos were. That's what 16 years of flagging the same vulnerability was. Not stubbornness. Honesty. The refusal to pretend something was fine when I knew it wasn't. Nadine asked me once, after everything settled, whether I regretted how it played out. Whether I wished I'd done something differently. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I said I wish they had listened in 2009. Everything after that was just consequence. She nodded. She didn't push further. She understood. That's enough for me. Sitting in my own backyard now, with time ahead of me, and nothing left to prove to anyone. I know who I was in that building for 26 years. I know what I built and why I built it, and how carefully I tried to protect it. Nobody can take that accounting away from me. The system is running. Britta has it. That's how it should end.